Lecture 2 Operating Segment. Learning objectives. The student should be able to know the core principle of segment reporting, understand the concept of an operating segment, identify the information required to be disclosed for a reportable segment. First, let us define operating segment. So what is operating segment? According to PFRS 8, operating segment is a component of an entity that engages in business activities from which it may earn revenues and incur expenses, including internal with other segments of the same entity. We already discussed what is a component of an entity. Also, it is a component of an entity whose operating results are reviewed regularly by the entity's CODM, Chief Operating Decision Maker, to make decisions about resources to be allocated to the segment and assess its performance. Since traceable yung revenue and expenses from that certain segment, then the CODM will assess the performance, the financial performance of that certain segment, and then based on the performance of that certain segment, the shift operating decision maker will allocate the resources. Now, the CODM is not a position actually. So, the CEO, the CFO can be the chief operating decision maker. Operating segment also is a component of an entity for which discrete financial information is available. Now, the standard governing segment reporting or operating segment is PFRS 8. Now, who must apply this standard? According to the standard, each entity whose debt or equity instrument are traded in a public market or yung mga public entities natin. Or kahit hindi pa traded and public market yung instrument nila, pero in the process na sila of filing their instrument on a public market. So note, PFRS 8 is applicable for both separate financial statement and consolidated financial statement. So if the parent prepare both the separate and consolidated, enough na yung mga reportable segment is presented sa consolidated. Now, what is the objective of reporting segment information? Bakit meron pang PFRS 8? Bakit kailangan pang malaman ano yung mga reportable segment? Bakit kailangan pa itong makita? The objective of this statement is to establish principles for reporting financial information by line of business and by geographical area. Note, nung diniscuss natin si discontinued operation, isa sa definition ng component is that it is a line of business or it is a geographical segment. This is to help users of the financial statements to first, better understand the enterprise performance. Kasi kung as a whole lang, sa company lang, yung whole performance lang ni company yung titingnan natin, hindi natin may evaluate, ma-assess yung performance ng per segment. Let's say, si company A, meron siyang segment A, segment B, C, or D. Kung titingnan natin yung total revenue ni company A, kung for example, performing mataas masyado yung total revenue ni company A. Pero kung titingnan pala siya per segment, malalaman pala na yung isang segment doon is losing na. Tapos yung mga ibang segment is profitable pa masyado. So, kaya, importante yung reporting segment information to better understand the performance of the enterprise and to better assess the enterprise risk and returns, and make more informed judgment about the enterprise as a whole. Pag natitrace kasi natin, based on line of business and by geographical area, mas nakaka-decide tayo for the enterprise as a whole. Key definition and terms related to segment information. First, business segment. It is a component of an enterprise that provides a single product or service or a group of related products and services, and that is subject to risk and returns that are different from those of other segments. So, it provides a single product or service or a group of related products. Or for example, single product food products. So, or let's say, ano yung mga product line na yan. Okay, so yun yung business segment. That is subject to risk and returns that are different, meaning traceable siya for that certain segment. So, ma-distinguish natin yung cash flow, yung performance niya from other business segments. Geographical segment, from the word geographical, ang pinagkaiba dito yung environment. A component of an enterprise that provides products and services within a particular economic environment na different from those of components operating in other economic environments. So, magkaiba yung bawat segments based on their economic environment. Reportable segment, kasi pwedeng madaming segment si entity pero hindi lahat doon reportable. So, ano yung reportable segment? A business segment or geographical segment for which past 14 requires segment information to be reported. Pero may criteria tayo na madediscuss natin mamaya kung ano yung mga segment na reported or reportable. Segment revenue, revenue including inter-segment revenue or internal revenue. Let's say may sales ka, nagbenta ka from one segment from your segment to another. Let's say segment A, nagbenta ka segment B, so may sales siya from segment B, internal revenue yun or inter-segment revenue. So directly attributable or reasonably allocable to a segment includes interest and dividend income and related securities gains only if the segment is a financial segment, kasi pag revenue yung pinag-uusapan, kung financial institution yan, kasali sa revenue nila yung mga interest, yung mga dividend income. Segment revenue does not include interest or dividend income except nga lang kung bank insurance company yan, including loans to other segments, and it also does not include gains on sale of investment or extinguishment of debt. Note that income encompasses both revenue and gain. So, magkaiba si revenue, magkaiba si gain. So, si gain, hindi siya kasali sa term na segment revenue. Segment expenses. Expenses including expenses relating to inter-segment transactions, including expenses. So, pwedeng to third party na mga expenses and inter-segment expenses that result from operating activities and are directly attributable or reasonably allocable to a segment. Includes interest expense and related securities losses only if the segment is a financial segment, since normal to sa operation ng business ng mga financial institution. Segment expenses, as in general rule, exclude losses, share of losses, income taxes, and general corporate administrative and head office expenses. You must be familiar with this kasi kasali to sa computation. Mamaya, dun sa criteria natin in order na ma-identify ano yung mga reportable segment. Segment result. Segment revenue minus segment expenses before deducting minority interest. Segment assets and segment liabilities, those operating assets that are directly attributable or reasonably allocable to a segment. Criteria for a segment to be reportable. So, the business segment and geographical segment is reportable if they met the following criteria. First, its revenue from sales to external customers and from transaction with other segments, meaning both external and internal revenue, is 10% or more of the total revenue, external and internal, of all segments. Another criteria, each segment result, whether profit or loss, is 10% or more the combined result of all segments in profit or loss, the combined result of all segments in loss, whichever is greater in absolute amount. Okay, kung loss yan, di ba? Usually negative yan. Pero in absolute amount, let's say, ang profit 10,000, yung loss 5,000. So, absolute amount, yung higher dyan is the 10,000. The profit. Or let's say, yung loss 10,000, yung profit 5,000, yung higher dyan 10,000. Kasi absolute amount yung tinitingnan natin. So its segment result, whether profit or loss, is 10% or more, the combined result of all segment in profit or the combined result of all segment in loss, whichever is greater in absolute amount. Or, its asset are 10% or more of the total asset of all segments. So, tandaan. First, revenue, external and internal. Next, whichever is higher sa total combined profit or total combined loss in absolute amount. And then, total asset. So, kahit isa lang sa tatlong ito ma-meet ng segment, considered na siya as reportable. Overall test. Kasi yung kanina, test natin bawat segment nun. Now, overall test. If total external revenue attributable to reportable segments, let's say, okay, segment A, B, C, D, tinest natin yung 10% threshold from the previous slide. So, pumasok si A and B ngayon. So, si A and B ngayon yung mga reportable segment natin. Ngayon, sa overall test, kailangan natin i-test yung external revenue. Kasi if total external revenue attributable to reportable segments identified using the 10% threshold outlined from the previous slide is less than 75% of the total consolidated or enterprise revenue, external revenue, kasi pag enterprise revenue, syempre, kailangan na-eliminate si internal or intersegment revenue. Additional segment, pag hindi niya, for example, segment A, B, C, D, tinest natin sa 10% threshold, ang pumasok lang si segment A, segment B, yun lang yung reportable. Then ngayon, sa segment A and segment B, yung overall test na naman natin. Kumbaga, titingnan natin yung total external revenue nitong segment A and B, and i-compare natin sa total consolidated revenue ng lahat ng segments. Kung for example, ito sa segment A and segment B, yung total external revenue nila is 75% of the total consolidated revenue of the total segments, then okay na. Pero paano pag hindi? Paano pag kulang? Let's say, yung total external revenue ni segment A and B is only 70%. So, hindi nila na-meet yung 75% test. So, kailangan dagdagan yung reportable segment. Okay? Paano? Hindi nakapasa sa 10% threshold si segment C and D. Paano natin dadagdagan yung segment A and B? Additional segments should be identified as reportable segments even if they do not meet the 10% requirement until at least 75% of total consolidated or enterprise revenue is included in reportable segments. O laging tatandaan, so it doesn't mean na na-meet na yung 10% threshold, yun na kaagad yun. Kung sino lang nakamit ng 10% threshold, yun na yung reportable segment. Kasi pwede pa din na pag tinest natin yung mga na-identify na reportable segment is hindi pala nila na-meet yung overall 75% na requirement, then kailangan siyang dagdagan. So, paano? Paano siya dadagdagan? Actually, kadepende yan sa management. So, si CODM, Chief Operation Decision Maker ngayon is magde-decide. So, pwedeng magkaroon ng aggregation since, for example, yung mga remaining segment is hindi nila ma-meet yung 10% threshold. So, pwedeng i-aggregate na lang sila para lang ma-meet nila yung 10% threshold. Ganon. Let's say, segment A, B, C, D, E. Okay, yung nakapasa lang sa 10% threshold si segment A and B. Then, after nung segment A and B, nung tinest sila para sa overall test, hindi sila nakapasa, hindi nila na-meet yung 75%. So, therefore, kailangan silang dagdagan. So, paano ngayon pipili sa remaining segment? Paano pipili kay C, D, and E? So, pwede na i-aggregate si C or D, or si C and E, or si D and E. Paano ngayon yung aggregation? Ano yung rule ng aggregation? Titingnan kung pareho ba ng nature. Ano sa mga segments yung pareho ang nature, pareho ng distribution, na pwedeng i-aggregate natin. So, as long as the segments have similar economic characteristic, they can be aggregated. Pag na-aggregate na yan, tapos tines ulit sa 10% and nakapasok, so itetest ulit sa 75% until maging 75%, then okay na yung reportable segments. Let's say, nung in-aggregate natin si segment C and D, then binangga natin sa 10% threshold, na-meet niya na yung criteria. Tapos, nung in-overall test ulit natin is napasok na din niya yung 75% test. Then, yung reportable segment is A, B, C, and D. So, yung non-reportable is si segment E lang. Now, let's proceed. Rules na dapat tandaan in operating segment. Information about other business activities and operating segments that are not reportable shall be combined and disclosed in all other segments category. So, sabi ko nga, hindi lahat reportable. So, yung mga nakapasa lang sa 10% test, or kaya kung hindi man nakapasa sa 10% test, in-aggregate siya sa iba, tapos na-meet niya na yung criteria ng 10% test. Once ngayon na-identify na ni entity ano yung mga reportable segments, yung all other segments na hindi pasok or hindi reportable, i-aggregate silang lahat, i-combine, and disclose in all other segments. Parang isang line item na lang, all other segments category. If the number of reported segment exceeds 10, for example, merong 15 segments si entity, tapos yung reportable segment, yung pumasa sa 10% threshold, is 10 segments. So, pag 10 na yan, or nag-exceed ng 10, 11, then the entity should assess whether it is practical to report them all separately, kasi pag reportable segment, represent natin separately yung bawat segment. And whether the information is too detailed, kasi sobra na ng 10 Kasi wala namang precise limit ng reportable segment, pero kapag nag-exceed na ng 10, kailangan ma-alarma na si entity, kailangan niya nang i-consider practical limit na ba yung na-reach or hindi. Okay? Kasi kung masyado ng detalyado, kasi re-report natin separately yung, let's say, segment A to segment K. Ang dami na nun. 'Di ba? So, pag na-report mo yan lahat, too detailed na siya masyado, baka hindi na magamit yung information. If the management identifies new reportable segment based on quantitative thresholds in the current reporting period, the comparative information for the previous reporting period should be restated in order to disclose the new segment separately also in the comparative period. So, for example, this year, na-meet niya yung 10% threshold. Last year, hindi niya na-meet yung 10% threshold. So, this year, reportable segment siya. Last year, hindi. Pero ngayong year, pag nag-prepare siya ng comparative report, comparative period, kailangan comparable yung mga information. So, hindi magiging comparable kung ang magre-reflect non-reportable siya last year, tapos reportable siya this year. So, dapat para comparable yung information, i-restate natin yung previous reporting period. So, i-restate natin na kung last year hindi man siya reportable, pero since reportable na siya this year, i-restate natin yung last year. Only for comparative purposes, para lang sa comparative figures. Another, if management judges then An operating segment identified as a reportable segment in the immediately preceding period is of continuing significance. Information about the segment shall continue to be reported separately and the current period even if it no longer meets any of the 10% quantitative threshold for reportability. Ito naman ibang case to. Last year, reportable siya. This year, hindi na siya reportable. So, last year, na-meet niya si 10% threshold. This year, hindi niya na-meet si 10% threshold. So, this year, hindi na dapat siya reportable, di ba? Yun yung general rule. Pero, based on the judgment of the entity, pag kahit hindi na siya reportable siya last year, hindi na siya reportable this year, pero ang assessment ni management, yung judgment niya, significant pa rin naman tong segment na to, importante pa rin to, material to, then, pwede niya pa rin present separately yung certain segment na yon. Kasi judgment naman ni management yung magpe-prevail. Okay? So, as long as merong continuing significance, then kahit hindi niya na yan na-meet yung 10% quantitative threshold, pwede yang i-report. Okay, let's have an illustration. You also have an illustration on your book. Now, for segment reporting, Baden Company is a diversified company which has developed the following information about its 5 segments. Given the information and instruction, identify which segments are significant enough to warrant disclosure in accordance with FASB number 131. This is PFRSI reporting disaggregated information about the business enterprise by applying the following quantitative test. So, we know this test, ito yung 10% test, diba? Revenue, operating profit or loss, whichever is greater sa absolute amount, and then identifiable assets test. So, first, sa revenue test tayo, ibig sabihin, yung total revenue nila, yung revenue test, both internal and external. Kasi yung external revenue, yun yung sa 75% overall test. Pero sa 10% test, both internal and external revenue. So, a segment is reportable if its total sales are 350,000 or more. Paano nakuha itong 350,000? Simple lang. Inad natin 600,000 plus 1.7 million plus 300 plus 320 plus 580,000. The total external or internal sales, hindi naman sinabi, basta the total sales revenue is 3.5 million. So, 10%, at least 10% ng total sales, 3.5 million times 10%. So, at least 350,000 or more. Pag na-meet niya to, pag lumampas siya dito sa criteria na to, or kahit hindi nga nag-exceed, at least 350,000 lang nito, then reportable segment siya. Okay, a segment is reportable if its total sales are 350,000 or more because this is the 10% of their total sales. So, tingnan natin isa-isa. Segment A, na-meet niya ba? Yes, sobra pa nga. Segment B, na-meet niya ba? Yes, sobra pa. Segment C, na-meet niya ba? Hindi niya na-meet. Kasi yung required 350, 300,000 lang yung sales niya. Therefore, not reportable. Next, letter D, 320. Na-meet niya ba? Hindi rin. Kasi kulang. 320 lang. So, hindi rin reportable. Next, letter E, 580. Reportable ba? Yes. Kasi sobra nga sa 350. So, na-meet niya yung criteria or yung threshold. So, based sa first criteria natin, segment A, B, and E satisfies the revenue test. So, letter C and D, not reportable pag yung letter A criteria yung ginamit natin. Pero ang rule kasi, kahit saan man dito, either A, B, or C, basta na-meet niya, reportable na siya. Hindi kailangan niya ma-meet niya si A, ma-meet niya sa B, ma-meet niya sa C. Kahit isa lang dito sa threshold na to, ma-meet niya, then makakonsider yung segment as reportable. Now, another is operating profit or loss test. Paano natin malalaman kung profit yung gagamitin natin or loss? simple lang. Whichever is greater sa absolute amount ng profit and ng loss. So titingnan natin dito. Ano yung loss? Si A lang yung loss and si D and si E. So A, D, E. Pag in-add natin yung total loss, 270 plus 300 plus 10. O merong 580,000 loss. Okay, 580,000 loss. Now, sa income naman, dalawa lang ang nagka-income or nagka-profit, si B and si C. So, total income 480 plus 40. So, we have 520 profit. Ang sabi, yung gamitin daw na threshold is 10% of the absolute greater of profit or loss. Sino bang greater? Absolute amount ha? So, magiging positive to si 580,000 loss. So, mas greater, malamang si 580,000 loss. So, 10% ng 580,000 loss, 58,000. So, therefore, yung threshold for letter B is 58,000. Now, titingnan natin kung pasado etong or na-meet nila yung criteria. Okay? Yung 58,000. 270,000, absolute amount ha yung gagamitin natin. Absolute amount. Sobra pa nga kasi 58 lang, 272. Okay? So, reportable. Next, 480. Sobra din. Kasi 58,000 lang. Ang laki nitong 480. Next, 40. Hindi umabot. So, not reportable pa rin. 300. Absolute amount. Na-meet niya yung criteria. So, pasok na. Reportable segment. Then, E. 10,000. Okay, kahit i-absolute natin to, hindi niya na-meet yung criteria na 58,000. Therefore, sa letter B na threshold, yung nakapasa lang is si A, B, and D. Kanina sa letter A, yung nakapasa si A, B, and letter E. Ngayon naman, A, B, and letter D. So next, last threshold, identifiable asset test. So given the identifiable asset, i-add natin ito lahat. 1.6 million plus 5.8 million plus 1.2 plus 3.9 plus 5.6 million. Total, 18,100,000. 10% lang, at least 10% dyan, considered na as reportable. So, 10% times 18,100,000. So, at least 1,810,000 assets, makakonsider na siya as reportable. Now, sino ang nakamit ng threshold na to? Si A, hindi niya na-meet, kulang siya. So, not reportable. Next, letter B. Okay. Na-meet niya yung criteria. So, reportable. Next, letter C. Hindi niya na-meet. The letter D, na-meet niya, 3.9. Letter E, 5.6, na-meet niya din. So, under letter C, identifiable asset test, yung nakamit ng criteria is segment B, segment D, and segment E. So, tingnan natin. Okay, kasi yung rule naman natin, hindi kailangan na ma-meet niya si letter A, si letter B, and letter C. Hindi kailangan na ma-meet niya lahat ng threshold para lang ma-consider siya as reportable. Kahit isa lang sa mga criteria or sa mga threshold na to ma-meet niya, considered na siya as reportable. So, dito, segment A, na-meet niya. So, segment A, B, and E, reportable. So, segment A and B, reportable. Si D din, kahit hindi niya na-meet yung letter A criteria. So, reportable pa rin si segment D. Okay, sa letter C naman, segment B, D, A. So, yung hindi, non-reportable segment lang is si segment C. Kasi si A na-meet niya si, okay, si A, B, E, na-meet natin sa first criteria, first threshold pa lang. Then, sa segment B, na-meet to need letter D. Sa segment, sa letter C naman na threshold, na-meet siya ni D, E, and B. So, only segment C lang ang non-reportable. Na kahit isa sa mga criteria na to, wala siyang na-meet or wala siyang na-exceed na or na-meet na threshold. So, therefore, non-reportable si segment C. So, pag tanong, ano yung mga reportable segment? Segment A, B, D, and E. So these are identified as significant and therefore reportable because they pass at least one of the significance tests. What information to disclose? Once the segment has been identified as reportable, the entity must disclose the following information. So, the general information about that reportable segment. So, ano yung mga factors used to identify reportable operating segments? Let's say, identifiable assets test, or profit or loss test, or kaya kung hindi niya naman na-meet yung 10% test, pero na-aggregate siya with the other segments. So, ano yung mga characteristics na binasihan ma-identify sila as reportable operating segments? Okay, number 2, information about profit or loss, asset, and liabilities. Syempre, reportable segment sila, na-identify sila as reportable segment. Therefore, significant sila sa entity as a whole. So, dapat makita yung separately ma-disclose yung profit from that segment, yung loss, yung asset, and liabilities. So, measurement of this amount shall be on the same basis as reported to Chief Operating Decision Maker. Now, also the reconciliation, the entity should reconcile total amount per operating segment with total amount reported and the entity's financial statements for revenues, profit or loss, asset, liabilities, other material information, the reconciliation, the breakdown nitong mga to per operating segments, per reportable operating segments. Now, entity-wide information about products and services of that segment, information about geographical areas, namely revenues from external customers and the country of domicile and in foreign countries. And number 2, certain non-current assets in the country of domicile and in foreign countries. And number 3, information about major customers. So, ano tong disclosure about major customer? So, according sa standard, major customer is defined as a single external customer providing revenue which amounts to 10% or more of an entity's external revenue. So, yung 10% test natin kanina sa sales is both internal and external. Pero sa major customer, since external customer siya, so nakabase lang sa external revenue. The entity shall disclose first the fact of reliance on major customer. Yung fact lang na ano yung pag-rely ni entity sa major customer. Okay, let's say yung computation natin 15% of the external revenue is from this customer. Pero hindi naman need na ma-disclose yung name ng customer. Yung fact lang ng reliance on the major customer. And the identity of the segments reporting the revenue. Okay, what are the segments reporting the revenue? Let's say segment A and B. Okay, for example, si major customer is si ABC company. Okay, yun yung major customer natin. Lagi sila napapurchase sa atin. So, sila yung major customer. Now, the fact of reliance on ABC shall be disclosed. And yung identity of the segment, anong segment sila laging bumibili, yung katransact nila lagi. So, identity of the segment reporting the revenue. Sino yung ano yung segment na nakaka-earn ng revenue from that major customer. But the entity is not required to disclose first the identity of the major customer. Hindi naman required na, for example, sa ABC, hindi required na nakalagay talaga yung pangalan ng ABC, siya yung major customer, no. Yung fact lang reliance, enough na. Pero kung disclose naman entity, okay naman. Pero hindi lang siya required. Hindi siya mandatory. And also, it is not required to disclose the amount of revenue that each segment reports from that customer. Let's say, si major customer is nag-earn siya ng revenue kay segment A and B. Okay lang na i-disclose lang ano yung mga segments na nagre-report ng revenue. So, i-disclose lang segment A and segment B. Hindi na kailangan i-disclose yung amount ng revenue of each segment from that customer. Okay? So, this is the disclosure about major customer. Now to review. Again, we have 10% test. We have 3 threshold. Revenue from sales to external and internal customers or consolidated sales. combined result of all segments in profit, or combined result of all segment and loss, whichever is greater in absolute amount. Kung mas greater si profit, then yun yung gamitin sa 10% threshold. Kung mas greater si loss in absolute amount, then yun yung gamitin. At least 10% of that, pag na-meet yan ng segment, then makakonsider siya as reportable. Next, total assets of all segments, 10%. At least 10% of total asset of all segment, pag na-meet to ng segment, the asset of that segment must be at least 10% of the total asset of all segments. So these are the three quantitative thresholds. Now, after we identify the reportable segments using the 10% test, then yung mga na-identify natin as reportable segment, i-under na naman natin sa 75% test. Now, if the total external revenue of the identified reportable segment is greater than or equal, meaning na-meet niya yung at least 75%, of the total external revenue of all segments, meaning identify man as reportable or not, of all segments of the entity, kung na-meet niya yung criteria na 75%, eto kasi yung una nating criteria. After natin na-identify yung reportable, i-subject natin sa 75% test. Pag na-meet yung 75% test, then no additional segment should be identified. But, if the total external revenue of identified reportable segment is less than 75%, so hindi niya na-meet yung 75% criteria of the total external revenue of all segments, then additional segments should be identified as reportable segments. Paano ngayon tayo makaka-identify ng additional segments? Hindi nga sila nakapasa sa 10% quantitative thresholds. So, papasok yung method of aggregation. So, yung mga remaining non-reportable, since need pa natin ng additional segments to be identified as reportable para lang mapasa yung 75% test, pwedeng i-aggregate natin. Pero yung ma-aggregate lang natin, those segments with similar economic characteristics. So, based na to sa judgment, professional judgment ng management ng CODM. Now, hanggang sa at least 75% of the total consolidated or enterprise revenue is included in reportable segment. Hanggang sa ma-meet nila to. Okay? Kasi for example, na-aggregate na natin yung meron na tayong na-aggregate ng mga segments, tapos tinest ulit natin sa 10%, meron na tayong additional segments na na-identify as reportable. Okay, pag tinest ulit sa 75% test, pag na-meet na yung criteria, then no additional segments na should be identified. Pero pag hindi pa din na-meet yung criteria, okay, mag-aggregate naman tayo ng another na naman ng mga segments para ma-meet yung 10% test, tapos i-subject na naman sa 75% test. Hanggang kailan mangyayari to? Hanggang ma-meet yung 75% na threshold. So, pag na-meet na si 75% threshold, wag na mag-add ng additional segments. Now, so sa major customer naman, revenue from that customer is 10% of more of an entity's external revenue. So, overall, ito lang yung computation sa part ng operating segments. Thank you and God bless.